You wanted me to write to you about the fight in Lewisburg. The balls flew worse than hail. I never thought about being shot till we went to retreat. I thought every jump was the last. The others was before me. I saw about 20 yards. Yankees was cross shooting at us. Thought I heard the balls whiz past us. I've got slim enough. It'll take a center shot to hit me now. George Caldwell.
Although General Crook drove the Confederates out of Lewisburg in Greenbrier in May of 1862, the town reverted to Southern control.
August 12th, to Brigadier General Averell, commanding separate brigade. Proceed with your cavalry and mounted infantry to Lewisburg, Greenbrier County, and dispose of any force of the enemy that may be there stationed. The law library of the Court of Appeals of Virginia will be taken and brought to Beverly. Great care will be exercised by the officer placed in charge that the books are not lost or injured. Transportation will be pressed, if necessary, by order of Brigadier General Kelly, commanding department.
The primary target of the August raid was this building in Lewisburg. Built in 1834, it housed the law library used by judges of the Supreme Court of Virginia. The new state of West Virginia needed the books in Wheeling.
It would have been a major symbolic victory. It would have been a major crowing point, and it also would have had a lot of practical applications for the simple reason that since West Virginia had been carved out of Virginia, it made sense that West Virginia's common law would be based on Virginia's common law. So having access to the law library and to the books would have been a useful thing for the newly formed judiciary of the state of West Virginia.
While moving through the mountains toward Lewisburg, the Yankees find themselves blocked. Confederate troops arrive at Rocky Gap near White Sulphur Springs, slightly ahead of Averell, and find cover. The vicious fight ensues.
Our regiment advanced through the cornfield, meeting with a murderous fire from the enemy, safely posted behind their breastworks. We pressed onward, but there were met with such a withering fire that human endurance could stand it no longer, and we fell back a short distance, taking position in a dry creek bed where we were partially sheltered. Private Frank Reeder, 2nd West Virginia Mounted Infantry.
There was some expectation that this battle being less than 2 miles from this world-famous resort, that the battlefield would somehow become an additional tourist attraction, would draw people to the area and give the people who ran the Greenbrier yet another thing to tout as a tourist destination. Sadly, that turned out not to be true, because if it was, we wouldn't have a Food Lion store right smack in the middle of the battlefield like we do today.
The pain of the wounded, the cries of the amputees. One has to listen through the traffic, envision through the neon the pain of those who suffered on this spot 150 years ago.
We are fortunate that we do have images that were taken of the battlefield right at the turn of the century, about 1903, 1904, and virtually nothing had changed. It had to have looked virtually identical to how it looked in 1863. And you can really get a good sense then of how the terrain played in, because this is a narrow valley surrounded by high ground on all sides, and it meant that there were very few opportunities for flanking maneuvers because of the terrain, which meant that the vast majority of Averell's attacks were direct assaults on a pretty strong Confederate defensive position.
The position of our regiment in the gully was a very exposed one now. General Averell, who was directing movements from the center of the line, ordered the 14th Pennsylvania Cavalry to make a diversion by charging down the road toward the enemy's fortifications. This brave body of men made one of the most daring charges of the war, not only facing a murderous storm of lead and hail from the front, but also, to their surprise, received an enfilading fire along their flank from infantry concealed in a cornfield to the left of the road. On they dashed, regardless of death and danger, and reached the breastworks of felled trees and fence rails thrown across the road. While endeavoring to force their way through, they were surrounded by the force upon their flanks and were nearly all killed, wounded, or captured. During the excitement of this heroic charge, the survivors of the second were withdrawn from their exposed position in the gully. Private Frank Reeder.
The firefight was severe. Given the size of the engagement, which was no more than probably about 5,000 men between both sides, the intensity of the engagement was as heavy as any you would find on any battlefield in the American Civil War, with heavy losses on both sides. You have good regimental commanders and subordinate officers with capable commanders of these brigades in Averell and in the form of George S. Patton, who do a fine job of fighting a battle. And what ultimately caused Averell to break off was the fact that he didn't get the reinforcements he expected, and he was nearly out of ammunition. Otherwise, I suspect he would have stayed there and continued to try and fight it out, because he knew Patton's men were running low too. But it reached a point where Averell's command was critically low on ammunition. He didn't get the reinforcements that he was hoping he would get, and as a consequence, I believe he finally came to the conclusion he had no choice but to break off and withdraw.
The Corps of Pioneers plied their axes with good effect upon many large trees near the road, cutting them nearly in two.
What he ordered his men to do as they were getting ready to retreat was to chop these trees to the point that only one or two more swings of the axe would be enough to bring them down, and they would bring them down crosshatched on either side of the road, creating this barrier that anybody trying to pursue would have to cut their way through in order to make any kind of an effective pursuit. And it was sufficient that before long the Confederates indeed broke off the pursuit because they just couldn't get through. So it was a very effective tactic, and one that Averell obviously learned from his own experiences earlier in the year at Kelly's Ford.
As the troops were withdrawn, Battery G, with their guns double-shotted with the last canister they had, grimly waited the expected advance of the exultant foe. As they came on with their usual yell, the battery boys let them have it red hot, and then limbering up their guns with the new horses they had procured during the night, pulled out in a trot. The Pioneers made their final cuts, and the trees fell across the road, completely blocking it. As the Confederate cavalry dashed up, they were greeted with a volley from the rear guard lying behind the fallen trees. Private Frank Reeder.
I think it's fair to say that the people of this little community, because other than the Greenbrier, there was very little there, suddenly were overwhelmed by casualties of both sides. And they had to care for them, and they ended up having to send for nuns to come to the battlefield to take care of these wounded men because there was no other means to care for them.